Welcome to the Brown County Historical Society City Cemetery Tour. The section that we're going to focus on today is the Pioneer section of the City Cemetery. This cemetery has been here since the 1850s when New Ulm was founded, and many of those who are buried in Tract A are those who were the victims of the Dakota War of 1862. This stone was placed here in 1992 by the junior pioneers of New Ulm and vicinity, and the purpose of the stone was to assist people in finding the graves of all of those who are buried in Tract A. This is the gravestone of Jacob Castor. Mr. Castor was a baker in 1862, and his bakery was approximately where the New Ulm City Library is located today. New Ulm was barricaded from 3rd North to Center Street, and then from Minnesota Street to Broadway. So Jacob Castor's bakery was outside of the barricaded area. At some point in time, he decided to go over the barricade and to his bakery to bring baked goods back into the barricaded area for the people to eat. New Ulm's population in 1862 was approximately 900 people, and when all of the people came in from outlying areas, our population swelled to over 1,500 people. So food was in great need. When he came back into the barricaded area, he was mistaken for a Dakota and he was killed in friendly fire. This is the Pauley Crypt, and the significance of this crypt is that Emily Pauley is buried here. Emily's parents were in the Dakota Hotel in 1862, and Emily was in the Erd building caring for a small child. She took the child in her arms and carried it across the street in order to get to her parents, and she was shot and killed in the crossfire. So Emily was the first victim of the First Battle of New Ulm on August 19, 1862. The small child that she was carrying survived, and we will look at her gravesite later in the tour. This is the grave of Jacob Nix. Jacob Nix was born in Germany and fled Germany in 1848 after the Social Revolution. Nix was living in New Ulm when the Dakota War broke out, and because our sheriff at that time, Sheriff Roos, did not have any military training, he turned the command of the town over to Jacob Nix. It was Nix who decided to barricade New Ulm from 3rd North to Center Street and to dig the trenches near the barricades for the defenders of New Ulm to take protection behind. And it was because of Jacob Nix and his training that New Ulm survived the first battle on August 19, 1862. This marker was erected by the citizens of Brown County in 1866. It was erected to honor those who had lost their lives in the Civil War and also those who had lost their lives in the defense of New Ulm. The marker has one symbol, which is a finger pointed up, and that symbolizes gone home. This is the stone for the Sider family. The Sider family moved to New Ulm in the 1850s and erected the Dakota Hotel. During the Dakota War, the Dakota Hotel was used for offices for the commanders during the Dakota War, and also as a refuge for women and children and as a hospital. In 1862, on August 18th, Milford came under attack, and when the people from Milford fled into New Ulm and gave word that they had come under attack, Helena Sider put her children in a buggy and fled to St. Peter and then to Traverse des Sioux. Here she talked to Charles Flandreau, who was an attorney and who had helped found New Ulm and done all of the legal work, and she gave word to him that she thought that New Ulm was going to come under attack by Dakota. Flandreau then got a group of citizen soldiers from Nicollet County and came to New Ulm and arrived shortly after August 19th and the end of the first battle. And he was here then to help and assist with the Second Battle of New Ulm on August 23rd. This is the grave for the Schell family. August Schell and his wife built the Schell's Brewery in New Ulm in 1860, and they were living in the brewery in a small house in 1862. When the word of the Dakota War broke out, they fled into New Ulm, and after the Dakota War was over, they found that nothing was touched out at the brewery. And the family strongly believes that their relationship with the Dakota and being on very good terms with the Dakota people was one of the reasons that the Schell Brewery was left undamaged. This is the grave for Dr. Charles Weschke. Dr. Weschke was the only physician in New Ulm on August 18th and August 19th during the First Battle of New Ulm. It was due to Dr. Weschke that all of those who were injured got care, and Jacob Nix himself said that he was standing in Minnesota Street conferring with someone about what they were going to do next when he was shot in the hand and lost his ring finger. And later in the day, he went into Dr. Weschke's office to get treated and found the man leaning against the wall with his eyes shut, trying to rest. And he felt so bad, he said in his narrative, to have disturbed this man who had done so much work during the day that he left and went and found a woman to bandage his hand. This is a stone for Charles Roos. Charles Roos was sheriff in 1862, and it fell on him to make the decisions of what to do when the people from Milford began coming into New Ulm saying that they had come under attack. Roos, who had no military training, turned to Jacob Nix, who had training, and let him become commandant of New Ulm and take over the fortifications and guide New Ulm through the First Battle of New Ulm until help arrived from St. Peter, and Flandre was then given the command of the defense of New Ulm. This is the gravestone for the Gross family. Philip Gross and his wife came to New Ulm in the early 1850s and built the Gross Hotel, today known as the Grand Hotel. During the Dakota War, New Ulm did not have a hospital. Physicians set up in little offices, but they needed a hospital, and they took the hotels in New Ulm, such as the Dakota and the Grand Hotel, which had many rooms and many beds, and used them as hospitals to take care of the wounded. Also, during the Dakota War, when those bodies were picked up from the Leavenworth Rescue Expedition on 5th North and other people passed away inside the city limits, they were buried in the soft ground around the Dakota Hotel and eventually disinterred in November and buried out here at the New Ulm City Cemetery. This is the military stone for J. Carl Merkel. Mr. Merkel served in the Civil War. Prior to leaving for the Civil War, he had married Veronica Fink, and they had a son, Carl August Merkel, who was born in 1859. His wife passed away in January of 1861, and Mr. Merkel left his young son in the care of his in-laws, Mr. and Mrs. Fink, to care for him while he was in the Civil War. On August 18th, Milford came under attack, and his mother and father-in-law and his young son lost their lives. This is the Massapust gravesite. The Massapust family is related to the Harkin family, and at one time the Harkin store was called the Massapust store. They are also married into the Uni family. The Massapusts lived in Milford Township in 1862, and when the Dakota came through, they killed the elder Franz Massapust and two of his daughters, Julia and Mary, and then also Mr. Massapust's grandson, Franz Jr. Later on, Benedict Uni Sr. married Ernstine Massapust, And Benedict Uni's family had also been severely affected by the Dakota War. His son, Benedict Jr., had been taken captive, and several of his other children were killed. Benedict Uni Jr. wrote a wonderful little book called Held in Captivity, which recounts his captivity in one of the most even-minded ways that you could possibly recount a captivity. And it is a little booklet that is used by both the Dakota and schools in this area to teach about the Dakota War. This is the Schilling grave site. Adolf Schilling and his wife lived in Milford in 1862. Their two sons, August and Louis, had gone into the Civil War, and their daughter, Cecilia, was taking care of Mrs. Stocker on the Stocker farm in Milford Township on August 18th. The Dakota came to the Stocker farm and surrounded it and set it on fire. Mr. Stocker's wife was ill and she burnt to death. And little Cecilia, who was about 11 years old, and Mr. Stocker escaped through a basement window and ran into the cornfields and to New Ulm for safety. Her father, Adolf, was killed, and his wife and son were wounded, and though they fled into New Ulm and met up with Cecilia. And the father was dragged into the basement by neighbors and left to hopefully not be mutilated by the Dakota as he died. The Schilling brothers, August and Louis, got word through the newspapers that something had gone wrong in New Ulm and wrote a letter, which we have at the Brown County Historical Society, which they are asking their sister to let them know what had happened to the family and that they prayed that they weren't involved. Sadly, their father was dead, their brother was dead, and their mother was severely wounded and in Chicago recovering. This is the monument to Wilhelm Fender. Wilhelm Fender was born in Germany and founded Turnvereins in Germany and then in the United States. And eventually it was the Turner Colonization Society from Cincinnati under the leadership of Wilhelm Fender who came to New Ulm in 1856 and merged with the Chicago Land Company to found New Ulm. During the Civil War, Wilhelm joined the U.S. Army and was gone from his farm in Milford Township on August 18, 1862. Jacob Nix stopped at the Fender home and picked up Catherine Fender and her children and brought them into New Ulm for safety. After the Dakota War, Wilhelm Fender left his farm and became the commandant at Fort Ridgely for several years. And during that time, a man by the name of Heinrich Boucher farmed his property. In May of 1863, while Heinrich was out in the fields, he was attacked by a small group of Dakota Indians and killed. And he is one of the last victims in Brown County of the Dakota War. On the morning of August 18th, a recruiting party headed out into Milford Township, right along County Road 29, which is behind me. And the purpose of the recruiting party was to go out to the farm sites and ask young men to sign up for the Civil War because Lincoln was asking for more men. When they got out to the Antone Hanley farm, which is near the Milford Monument, the Dakota came up out of a ravine and attacked the wagons carrying the men from New Ulm that were out recruiting. The people who were killed in that incident were Julius Fensky, Ernst Dietrich, and Johannes Schneider, along with several other people who were wounded and then died at a later date. These people were brought back into New Ulm and buried near the Grand Hotel, and then in November of that year relocated out to the cemetery proper. One of the things we noticed when we were working at marking the unmarked graves of those who died in the Dakota War was how careful they were when they reburied these people. And a good example is over here by the Schneider grave. This grave shows that Johannes Schneider, who was killed on August 18th of 1862, had a young son who had been born in April of 1861 and died on August 17th of 1862, the day before his father was killed. So this widow had not only lost her child the day before, but lost her husband the day after. And when they were buried in November of 1862, they took the care to put that little child next to his father. This is the Bobleter Monument, and we're going to focus on Ida Bobleter, who was born in 1861. This is the young child that Emily Pauley was carrying from the Dakota Hotel to the Erd Building, or vice versa, on August 19, 1862, when Emily was killed and the young child was dropped and survived. And she went on to marry Brigadier General Joseph Bobleter, who is the father of the National Guard. Oh, we forgot old man Kruger. This is the grave of Johann Kruger. Johann Kruger was from Milford Township, and he came into New Ulm for safety with his family and went out over the barricades with Captain Dodd, who had come from St. Peter, to bring what they thought were settlers trying to get into the barricades into New Ulm and to safety. What they found as they went over the Center Street barricades and farther down Minnesota Street was that they were Dakota. And Captain Dodd was shot and killed, and Johann Kruger was wounded. What's interesting about Johann Kruger's stone is that you can see that he did not die of his wounds until June of 1863. So we have a lot of people that were wounded and died later in life of their wounds that are probably not counted amongst the total of 600 and some people who lost their lives in the Dakota War. Those 600 people who lost their lives were for the most part unarmed and unaware, and that total of 600 people, if you take it per capita today, is more lost lives than in the World Trade Center bombings. On the morning of August 19th, before the First Battle of New Ulm started, a group of settlers from Leavenworth Township that had come into New Ulm to do business and heard about what had happened the morning before in Milford, begged Nix and Ruse to let them go outside of the barricaded area with wagons and into Leavenworth to bring their families into safety. This group of men took 3 wagons and began wending their way out to Leavenworth, and when they got out to the small settlement of Leavenworth, they found that the farm sites were abandoned and their families had somehow received word and fled into New Ulm by another route. So they turned their wagons around, and as they were coming down the 5th North Hill and got to the bottom, which was a large slough, they were unaware that the First Battle of New Ulm had started, and all of them except 6 were killed. And these are their graves. We have the Carrolls and the Loomises and the Tuttles. There was a man by the name of Lamb who lies here in an unmarked grave. And in one of the narratives, it said that when they reburied their bodies in November of 1862, there was such a shortage of coffins that they, at times, buried them two to a grave. And this stone here has a Loomis and a Tuttle buried with one stone, which leads us to believe that they are possibly buried together in one coffin. One of the questions that I get asked most often by researchers coming into the library looking for information on their ancestors is, where are they buried? And that question is asked quite often about those who were killed in the Dakota War of 1862. I had a woman come into my office 20-some years ago who was related to the May family, and she had been searching most of her life for the graves of her ancestors. When I was looking at microfilm one time, looking for someone else's grave, I realized why she couldn't find the grave, and that was because the name May as a last name had been mistaken as a first name, and so they were transposed in the grave index. When I gave her that information, she bought a stone, and she had a memorial ceremony out here, and she put down the names of Sebastian May and Barbara May and their little children Henry and Bertha. And this was done close to 100 years after the Dakota War. The other three children from the May family were a set of twins and an older daughter. All three of them had been clubbed and left for dead on their farm and were picked up by the members of the Leavenworth Rescue Expedition and brought into New Ulm and given care. Friedrich May disappeared. He had epileptic seizures for the rest of his life and amnesia from the clubbing, and they had to finally declare him dead. The other two girls went on to get married, and they have descendants that still live here today. This is a mass memorial marker, and it was placed here in 1882 by the descendants of the Hanley, Zettel, Zeller, and Fink families, and the wife of Benedict Drexler. In German on this side, it says why the marker has been placed, and it says it is in memory of those who lost their lives in 1862. And then below that it said, it has been erected by Athanasius and Elizabeth Hanley, Conrad and Elizabeth Zeller, John and Maria Bobleter, and Matthias and Margaretha Hemsch. Mrs. Hemsch was formerly Mrs. Benedict Drexler. Then on this side it lists the names of those who were killed: Max and Lucretia Zeller, born Fink, and their children, John and Monica, and Cecilia and Barbara, and Conrad Zeller and Philippina Zeller, born Fink. And on the other side it lists more names. What we found in 2012 for the 150th anniversary was that none of the actual grave sites were marked. And so in 2013, the Junior Pioneers wrote a grant and marked all of the individual graves, which you see here, starting out in the corner with Mr. and Mrs. Fink, and then all of their daughters and sons and their wives and their children, who were all killed on the same day. And I think that marking these graves is extremely important, so that in the future, people who come out to this cemetery understand what happened in Brown County and the surrounding area in 1862, and the large loss of lives that took place with people who were innocent and unaware and unarmed. In this short video, we can't tell you all of the individual stories of the people who are buried here, but there are a few that are particularly touching, and one of those is Florian Hartman. Florian and his wife, who was related to the Hanley family, her maiden name was Hanley, lived on a farm in Milford Township, and Florian was out in his fields with a neighbor man who was helping him with the crops by the name of Roner. Mr. Roner and Mr. Hartman were killed by the Dakota, and his wife came out to the fields and found him laying there mortally wounded. He told her to get into the cornfield and hide, because if she kept staying by him, the Dakota might come back and kill her too. She went into the cornfield and found that the family dog kept going to the dead body of her husband and back into the cornfield where she was. And after he went back and forth several times, she became so fearful that he was going to give away her hiding spot that she took off her apron and she strangled the dog to death. She wandered for 6 weeks out in Milford Township until finally she was found on a road by her brothers, Anton and Athanasius Hanley, who hardly recognized her. These are the graves of the Roner family. Mr. Roner was working on Mr. Hartman's farm and was killed along with him out in the fields. His wife was at home on their farm nearby, taking care of her young son, and she and her son were both killed by Dakota on August 18th of 1862. So this entire family was lost. When I was a student at St. Paul's Lutheran Grade School, my teacher was Theodore Pelzel, and he would often tell a story about his grandparents who were killed in the Dakota War of 1862. His grandmother, Brigida, walked out of her cabin in Milford Township and was killed in the middle of the road. Her husband, Johann, came out to help her and was wounded and ran off into the cornfields. And there, like many of the other settlers, he wandered for weeks, living off of potatoes and corn and whatever he could find, until his family found him and brought him into New Ulm, where he died in March of 1863. After I started working at the Brown County Historical Society, I often thought about what my teacher had told me about his family in the Dakota War and wondered where their graves were. And in 2012, when we laid out a cemetery tour for the 150th anniversary of the Dakota War and worked with the sextons out at the New Ulm City Cemetery, we found these graves, and in 2013, the junior pioneers marked them. I found this to be one of the most fulfilling things I've done in the history field, and I think it's extremely important to remember history. And I hope that you have found this short documentary on the Dakota War interesting and that you would like to learn more about it. You can come into the Brown County Historical Society and into the Research Library and ask for me. I'm Darla Gebhard, Research Librarian for the Brown County Historical Society in New Ulm.